remarkable people. But it is also a story of repeated invasions, heroic resistance, and countless wars. The tragedy is that the West's often willful ignorance of Afghanistan's recent past has condemned her people to a seemingly endless struggle for survival. It is a story that's come to dominate my life. The mountains of the Hindu Kush cover most of Afghanistan, as well as the southern border with Pakistan. This is where the Taliban came to power and where Al-Qaeda had their training camps. From these camps came the hijackers who destroyed the Twin Towers on September the 11th, 2001. In retaliation, America bombed the Taliban out of power. History has shown again and again that exercising control over Afghanistan is easier said than done. The Americans are the last in a long line of foreigners who've tried to bend the turbulent Afghans to their will. Few have succeeded.
They've often been conquered, but they've never been subdued and dominated. They don't play by normal rules.
One of the things you learn if you look at history is that, for example, strength of force and firepower cannot control necessarily a country, particularly when you have a country with mountainous, difficult terrain and very determined and proud and independent people.
I first visited Afghanistan in 1982, 2.5 years after the Soviet invasion, when President Brezhnev sent in the Red Army to prop up the new and unpopular communist government in Kabul. Soon after the invasion, all Western journalists were banned, and the only way to report the war was to travel with the Mujahideen resistance. This meant crossing the border illegally and walking across the mountains. Few television networks were prepared to spend the time and money. So coverage of the war was sparse, which meant that Russian atrocities went largely unreported.
We got together a documentary team, and we literally disappeared into Afghanistan for a couple of months simply to tell the world the story, because something was going wrong, but the world didn't really know what.
My camera team, the producer Nigel Ryan and I, went in with an arms convoy, fording rivers and often travelling at night to avoid Russian helicopters. It took us 12 days to walk the 200 miles to the Panjshir Valley, northeast of Kabul, the stronghold of a young guerrilla leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud. We arrived to find the Russians bombing the valley and just about to launch a ground attack. Despite the destruction of their villages and a steady flow of casualties, Massoud's Mujahideen and the civilian population were determined to keep fighting. I was fascinated to know who was going to win this war. Could the Mujahideen possibly withstand the might of the Red Army? But I was also attracted by the beauty of the country and the resilience and courage of the people. And since then, Afghanistan has come to dominate my life and also the life of my family. Afghanistan is a victim of its geography as well as of its history.
I suppose Afghanistan in some ways is like a sort of Switzerland of Asia. It's a small mountainous country in the middle of Asia. But whereas in Switzerland, in Europe, the battles went round Switzerland, in Afghanistan the battles had to go through, because Afghanistan stood astride the main route into India.
Afghanistan has been a highway for conquerors, at the same time a crossroad of civilizations and religions, and a roundabout of trade routes.
The country's strategic position on the ancient Silk Route, which linked the trade of China, Rome and India, meant that it was repeatedly fought over despite its rugged terrain.
The different ethnic groups in Afghanistan are really a product of history, of these armies travelling through. Several of them, for example, the Uzbeks in the north and the Hazaras in the central, are the remnants of different invading armies.
This ethnic diversity has led to centuries of tribal conflict, but it's the past 26 years of revolution, occupation and civil war which have made Afghanistan one of the poorest countries in the world. Despite all the invasions and the tribal wars, the one thing that does unite the Afghans is their violent hatred of foreign domination. More than 2,000 years ago, Alexander the Great, the king of Macedon, was one of the first to try and conquer it.
He swept right over, in through Turkey first of all, then through Persia, and then chased the last of the Persian emperors up into northern Afghanistan.
Afghanistan at that time had no central power, and it looked as an easy passage for him. But when he started his stride, it took him 4 years to get rid of problems in Afghanistan.
By the time he was 30, Alexander had conquered most of the known world, including the warlike tribes of what is now Afghanistan, who are a constant thorn in his side. He died on his way home, still only 32. While Alexander the Great's empire didn't survive his death by much, his cultural legacy lived on for a long time.
In the northern parts, in the villages, in the remote parts of northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, people still remember Alexander the Great. He's still a name to conjure with after all those centuries and years.
Not only did he win battles, but he brought with him in his baggage train Greek civilization. One of the results was the art of Gandhara, a blend of Greek and Indian culture which emerged several centuries later and led to the first representation of the Buddha in human form. The humanization of the Buddhas reached its climax most dramatically in the two colossal statues carved in the mountainside at Bamiyan in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Bamiyan attracted pilgrims from all over Asia, who in turn spread the Buddhist message far and wide. 200 years later, as Islam spread across Afghanistan, the Buddhas remained untouched. Even when Genghis Khan, the Mongol conqueror, and his army, the atom bomb of their day, arrived in 1221, the Buddhas gazed down impassively as his troops massacred every living creature in the valley before he marched on to the west and further conquest.
He had formed a very effective army of cavalry men, well organized, tough, on small horses, and they swept across the rest of Asia. They swept into Central Asia, they swept down into Iran, they swept into Afghanistan, they swept right over into Russia under Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons. Genghis Khan himself lived to see his empire, probably one of the biggest in extent the world has ever known. And he did it pretty ruthlessly too. If people surrendered to him, that was fine, but if they didn't surrender, he would flatten the cities and kill everyone in it.
The Mongol invasion of Afghanistan resulted in devastating destruction and purposeless and passionless cruelty, destruction of agriculture, and pushed people towards nomadism.
For centuries to come, Afghanistan was to be the victim of many more invasions by foreign conquerors.
About 200 years later, there was another great world conqueror, a famous one, Tamerlane, who caused terror even in Europe. He went through Afghanistan, causing destruction. He was famous for building up pyramids of the skulls of the people he had killed. And then, about 100 years later, there was a much more benign conqueror who came down the area. This was the Emperor Babur, the first of the Mughal emperors. He was actually a lovely man, as we know from his diaries, because he was interested in everything, in the birds, in the costumes, in the music, and so on, and the paintings, and places where he passed. And that was a period of great luxury and sophistication. When the Mughal Empire became rather weak, and the Persian Safavid Empire, which had also struggled between them for Afghanistan, also became weak, and there was a period of sort of chaos. And in fact, in that situation of chaos, a Persian general emerged called Nadir Shah.
But within the decade, Nadir Shah had been assassinated, and his guard commander, Ahmad Shah Durrani, an Afghan, had taken over. In 1747, he was crowned, and for the first time, Afghanistan had become an independent country.
Of course, it was in this period that the power structures in the world changed. The great land empires, like the Mughals and like the Safavids in Iran and like the Ottoman Empire, became less strong, while the colonial empires developed their sea power around the world. And it was the beginning of the domination by Europe of the world, really.
What really went on behind the biggest political events of the last century?
According to 3 detainees at Guantanamo, bin Laden was in the caves until December the 7th.
Each week, the History Channel mines vaults and archives from around the world to reveal the untold stories of modern history.
She said, I'm Mao's dog, right? When Mao asked me to bite, I bit.
A revealing new series, Declassified, starts Saturday at 10 on the History Channel.
It all began with a great revolution.
The story of...
For much of the 19th century, Britain and Tsarist Russia competed for control of Central Asia in what was to be known as the Great Game. To protect India, the jewel in the crown, Britain was to fight 3 wars in Afghanistan. The first began in 1839, when the British sent a large army across the Indus to depose the ruler Dost Muhammad, believing he was too sympathetic to the Russians. Instead, they decided to install the ex-king Shah Shuja as a British puppet supported by British bayonets. But at home, the Duke of Wellington and many other eminent soldiers and statesmen opposed the war, prophesying shame and defeat. Nevertheless, the order was given to march. It was to prove a disastrous decision.
People in Delhi and London had an idea of what was called a forward policy. They thought they should establish security beyond India's borders. You could put it in modern parlance a sort of preemptive policy. But it was very badly planned, badly worked out.
Once installed, the new king was to prove hugely unpopular. The British envoy was assassinated, and worse still, General Elphinstone, whom the British had appointed to command in Kabul, was senile, ill, and indecisive, dithering his way to a terrible defeat. The deep resentment Afghans felt for the foreign occupier welled up in a savage hatred that was to show no mercy. The British withdrew from Kabul in the dead of winter. They travelled across snowbound passes without food or proper clothing, continually ambushed and sniped at by tribesmen. The withdrawal soon turned into a rout. Stragglers who escaped being ambushed or shot down like rabbits starved or froze to death. Despite the almost total breakdown of discipline, many died bravely, fighting to the bitter end, most famously at Gandamak, where the British made a heroic last stand. On January the 13th, 1842, a lone horseman stumbled into the British Army camp at Jalalabad. Of the 16,000 soldiers and camp followers who left Kabul, he was the only one to escape death or capture. His name was Dr. William Brydon, and for the rest of his life, he was to be known as the Last Man. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by the British Army. A seemingly invincible force was outmanoeuvred and finally cut to pieces by what was seen as a motley horde of turbaned tribesmen. When the news of the defeat reached London, Victorian Britain was horrified and shocked.
The forward policy was abandoned, and the British said, all right, we'll have nothing to do with Afghanistan. They allowed Dost Muhammad to go back as king. And then for a period of about 30 years, the British sort of kept their hands off. They watched the Russians, but they didn't interfere until it came to the time of the Second Afghan War.
Only 36 years later, Britain's need for security and fears of Russian expansionism led to a second invasion of Afghanistan.
The lessons of history can be forgotten soon by any government and any individual. But I don't think the British didn't learn a lot. They wanted a brief intervention. They wanted to stop Russian.
By 1878, the British were once again worried about Russian influence. And they had more reason in this time because Dost Muhammad's successor and son was intriguing with the Russians. And in fact, it was found out later that he'd signed a secret treaty with them. So the British were very angry. They moved some forces into the southern part of Afghanistan, and they insisted that the Emir of Afghanistan accept a British mission and that he accepted British control over his foreign policy.
History was to repeat itself. The Afghans showed what they thought of the treaty by assassinating the British envoy. Soon afterwards, General Roberts, the ablest commander in India, fought his way into Kabul, crushed all the opposition in the city, and ruled with a rod of iron. In the south, meanwhile, another British army was being overwhelmed at Maiwand, near Kandahar. On hearing of the defeat, General Roberts' army made a forced march of over 300 miles from Kabul to win a decisive victory that ended the Second Anglo-Afghan War. It cost both sides much blood and money. In the end, apart from British honour, little else was satisfied. Except perhaps for Bobby the dog. Owned by Sergeant Kelly, Bobby survived the Afghan campaign despite being wounded at Maiwand. On his return to England in 1881, he was decorated with his own special Afghan War Medal by Her Imperial Majesty Queen Victoria herself. Nothing much changed for the next 50 years until in 1919 the Afghans, believing that Britain was losing control in India, launched an attack across the northwest frontier. The war was short and sharp, ending abruptly when the RAF bombed Kabul and Jalalabad. The peace treaty was signed in 1921, not only ending the third and last Anglo-Afghan war, but giving Afghanistan full independence for the first time, an independence that was to last until the Soviet invasion of 1979.
The British at that time didn't want any fuss. They were exhausted after the First World War, and they were very happy to let the Afghans run their own affairs and have complete independence. So Amanullah then became the king, and Amanullah was a strange character, an important character in Afghan history, because he wanted to make Afghanistan a modern, secular state. But he was very much in advance of his time.
What you can see is different attempts towards changing Afghanistan and transforming the country into a modern country. The first attempts by the king was toppled by tribal revolts.
He got his wife to appear in public and take the veil off, and then he tried to persuade all the people to dress in Western clothes. They finally rebelled. They said enough is enough. He was thrown off the throne, sent into exile, and the country was in chaos.
Peace was restored in 1929, and the country survived for 50 years as a more or less benevolent monarchy, until the king was deposed by his cousin and former prime minister.
Prince Daud was a key figure in Afghanistan. He was a dynamic, tough character who was a modernizer, didn't brook any opposition.
Daud, who was the cousin of the king, in alliance with a number of leftist officers who were educated in the Soviet Union, decided to topple the monarchy and establish the first republic in Afghanistan. It was a bloodless coup.
Daud then tried to break from his communist advisors. This time the result was anything but bloodless.
The communists decided they weren't going to lose control, and they did a coup. And Daud and large numbers of members of his family, many of the people I knew, were massacred in the royal palace.
Life before the Russian invasion was very simple and normal. People were busy with their lives and their jobs. There was democracy. The government was accepted by people. No one had political problems with each other.
In December 1979, Afghanistan was to become a battleground of the Cold War, when 80,000 Soviet troops invaded the country to support the unpopular and crumbling communist government. In December 1979, the Red Army arrived, still wearing the laurels of invincibility that they'd won against the Germans in the Second World War. But Afghanistan was to be their Vietnam.
They no doubt thought they could sort of expand the boundaries of the Russian Empire. But they made the same mistake that the British had made earlier and other people were to make later. They didn't realize the resistance and the independence of the Afghan people.
The Soviet forces came into Afghanistan more as a local police operation than a serious invasion. Not only were they not welcomed with open arms, they were openly opposed by the entire population. And the one thing that unites Afghanistan is the presence of an enemy, and all the country united against them. And what they had no notion of was that they were in for a huge, huge defeat.
Ever since the communists came to power, people had the feeling that the Russians would come to Afghanistan. Before the Russian invasion, they committed many crimes. They put thousands of people in prison, raped women, tortured and harassed people. And finally, many Afghans emigrated to Pakistan. The Mujahideen were Afghan people who took up weapons and made contact with many parties based in Peshawar.
During my first visit to Afghanistan in 1982, Soviet jets and helicopters dominated the skies. Trekking into the Panjshir Valley, I find myself in the midst of a huge Russian offensive, as villages were being bombed daily in an attempt to destroy the Mujahideen.
When we got in to the Panjshir Valley, which is north of Kabul, that was where Ahmed Shah Massoud was in charge. And there we found, our first impression was what scorched earth policy is really like. Something like 40% of the population had evacuated. Every village had been bombed. The Russians had a policy of going in with a train of tanks and soldiers and just destroying everything they needed to. And then they would pull out again, leaving the place razed. Meanwhile, the villagers retreated to the mountains.
I met their leader, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was a priority target. Starting out with only 40 men and a handful of old weapons in the summer of 1979, he'd built up the nucleus of a tough and well-trained guerrilla army.
Like Churchill, who told the British at the beginning of the Second World War that they were brave, and they became brave as a result. Massoud did that with his people. He whipped together these young Mujahideen and told them they were heroes, and they became heroes. And they ran rings around the Soviet army.
Despite the odds, lack of communications and modern weapons, Massoud was supremely confident.
We do not consider victory as the stopping of the fighting. Victory for us means being able to escalate the war against the Russians as much as possible. It's then that the Russians will be prepared to leave Afghanistan, or at least to come to the negotiating table.
Massoud, who was a brilliant guerrilla leader, had information of what their movements would be and always retreated before they came and then shot down on them and very often ambushed them and blew up tanks.
In 1981, I was commander of many villages in Bazaraka Panjshir, which is in central Panjshir. There we gave military training to the people. There were also many operations which took place in Panjshir. The 9th biggest operation, made by the Russian 40th Army, received a lot of casualties, especially in the area that was under my control.
In the face of Mujahideen opposition, the Russian forces dropped thousands of anti-personnel mines from the air, maiming and killing thousands of Mujahideen and even more civilians.
On
the Salang Highway and in Panjshir, which was our area, when the Russians came to the highway, all the roads connected to the highway, or around their army bases, or where they knew our routes were, or anywhere where they felt in danger, they scattered mines. They caused many deaths. I've lost many of my friends.
Medical facilities were almost non-existent. The French volunteer doctor we travelled in with was almost certainly the only fully qualified doctor in the whole of the Panjshir Valley that year. We met one of Massoud's commanders, Abdul Wahid, who had had a foot blown off by a Russian mine. Massoud asked if we could help him.
My father said, "I'll see what I can do when I get back to London." And I think several months later, he got a phone call from Pakistan, and there was a voice saying, "Are the arrangements in place, and when should we come?" So I think the arrangements were quite quickly made, and Abdul Wahid came to Roehampton and had a prosthetic leg made there. And this led really to the idea of my father starting an appeal to help disabled Afghans.
An awful lot of the soldiers stepped on mines and had their feet blown off. A few months later, those that were lucky enough to get replacement legs through Sandigore or other sources were back fighting again, as if nothing had happened. They are a very remarkable race.
2 years later, the war was still grinding on, and I went back to see what was happening. Soviet helicopter gunships were continuing to savage the Mujahideen, and their only means of defense was the Soviet-made SAM-7 missile, which often failed to work.
The war with Russia was unfair. On the one side, the people of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen started jihad, our war, with empty hands and old weapons. At that time, the best weapons we had were the Kalashnikov and the RPG-7. We only used these two types of weapons. But later, we used 82mm mortars. The Russians used against us the most modern weapons, good aircraft, and a trained, powerful army.
The threat of a Russian victory led the United States finally to send the Mujahideen a replacement for the ineffective SAM. They chose the Stinger, and its success against the Soviet gunships transformed the war and hastened its end.
اینی تا یک جوی است کلش من کاری پیش مسجد من کاری اینی خانقاه من کاری درست اینی جم من کاری فقط خود جور کرد نه.
By 1986, Massoud was strong enough to mount an attack on a communist government fort at Farhar in the north. We watched his guerrillas take the fort on the second day, capturing most of the garrison.
Gradually, the strength of the Mujahideen, the independence groups in Afghanistan, helped by the Americans and the British, and the Pakistanis particularly, made life so difficult for the Russians that they eventually had to withdraw.
In 1989, after 10 frustrating, demoralizing years, President Gorbachev pulled the Red Army out of Afghanistan. Massoud and his fellow Mujahideen had punctured the myth of its invincibility.
I would argue that the first crack in the Berlin Wall happened in Afghanistan.
The outside world soon lost interest. As far as it was concerned, the war was over and the Afghans had won, but at a terrible cost. Out of an estimated population of 15 million before the war, about 1 million had been killed and as many again wounded. Of the wounded, the majority were the victims of anti-personnel mines, scattered indiscriminately by the Russians from helicopters and aircraft, and laid with deadly precision round their camps and bases.
In Afghanistan, the statistics we have are not exact, but it's estimated 14 million mines were laid in different areas by the Russians. The majority of mines are anti-personnel.
Many of the victims were women and children, blown up when gathering firewood or herding the family sheep and goats.
The Soviet did drop mines all over the Panjshir Valley and all over the places that they couldn't control. And a lot of them were little plastic mines disguised as toys that a child would pick up and blow his hand off, and that defeated mine detectors.
Mine injuries are particularly unpleasant because basically the mines are designed to be either anti-personnel or anti-tank or anti-vehicle. Either way, when they blow up, they cause huge damage to any person in the vicinity.
Nobody to this day knows whether there are 2 million or 10 million mines in Afghanistan. It's just not knowable. Great areas have been cleared, but that is the legacy first of the Russians. It was repeated by war after that. But it was one of the most shameful legacies for those mines that blew apart children who were working in the fields.
The reason why they cause such devastating injuries is they involve both soft tissues and bone, and frequently it's, even with the most sophisticated modern techniques, impossible to reconstruct the limb following a mine injury, and so amputation is the only answer.
The Afghans are great survivors. For 10 years, from 1979 to 1989, the Russians waged a hugely destructive war against them, but lost. The Mujahideen then fought a 3-year war of attrition against the puppet government of President Najibullah, ending in Massoud's triumphant capture of Kabul in 1992. Peace beckoned, the future looked rosy.
The United States and the West became disinterested in Afghanistan, and that was the beginning of a tragedy for the country as well as for the region and the world.
Tragically, the victors turned on one another in a vicious civil war that tore what little remained of the country to shreds. This is when the West should have intervened to give its support. It failed to do so. Out of the turmoil came the Taliban. The Taliban captured Kabul from Massoud in 1996, and although unrecognized by the United Nations, ruled most of the country except the northeast, where Massoud was still holding out.
When they started to establish themselves in Kandahar, they were very popular because the people were so fed up with the lack of law and order and the banditry that they welcomed these new people who would get things really sorted out. And the Taliban were incredibly successful. They were supported by the Pakistanis, but they conquered Kandahar. They moved right. They took Kabul. They pushed the Northern Alliance, Massoud and his group, right up into the northeast of the country.
We supported the Taliban in Kandahar. The order came from the government to help Mullah Naqib. We even sent jet planes to bomb the area controlled by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Ghazni, where they fought against them, until the Taliban arrived at the gates of Kabul.
They ran the country successfully, but, of course, the people who'd welcomed them didn't realize until later how extreme they were.
Afghanistan is famous for its hospitality and good manners, and you really felt it was the antithesis of that. They didn't want you there. I mean, this is not true of all Taliban, of course, but there was a very hostile feeling in a lot of places.
The Taliban period was the worst time in Afghanistan's history. The crimes they have committed, the history of Afghanistan will never forget. Women did not have the right to work. They had to stay at home. Beards were compulsory for men. Men were not allowed to wear anything other than traditional clothes. People were forced to go to mosque or beaten by whips and sticks. Music was not allowed. Cutting hands off and executing people in public was normal for that period.
And the other trouble was the Taliban had allowed a Saudi, rich Saudi, to establish himself on their territory, where he trained thousands of terrorists. That, of course, was bin Laden. He didn't care at all about the normal precepts of tolerance and looking after women and children and so on. But the Taliban gave him a home, and no doubt he gave them some money.
Then, on September the 9th, 2001, in what appears to have been a preemptive strike against the Northern Alliance, Massoud was assassinated by al-Qaeda.
Suicide bombers posing as cameramen, and the bomb was either in the camera or in the belt round the cameraman's waist. Nobody quite knows, nobody's sure which. We stayed in the guest house in this last visit, where they spent a month waiting to interview Massoud, and when they did, they blew themselves and him up.
Martyr Massoud spent most of his life fighting for the freedom of Afghanistan. He fought against communism, afterwards against terrorism, and he sacrificed himself for his people.
2 days after his assassination, al-Qaeda struck again. American revenge, when it came, was decisive, bombing the Taliban and al-Qaeda out of Kabul and out of power.
He must have realized, and maybe the Taliban realized, that the world would retaliate, and would retaliate against his Afghan hosts. The Muslims accept the idea that if you do something bad, there is an idea of revenge and retaliation. So it was understandable that the Americans and the West would then want to invade Afghanistan. Unfortunately, they were able to do so partly because the Northern Alliance, although weak, was still in existence. And that's why the American and Western coalition forces were able, with the Northern Alliance, to throw the Taliban out. And the people were glad to get rid of them. And bin Laden was chased out of his lairs and his caves. But of course, he's still alive. He's still somewhere.
Since the overthrow of the Taliban, Afghanistan has really been opened up. There was an amazing sense of freedom when they were ousted from power. And it meant that a lot of the restrictions and the difficult working practices ended. But it also meant that people could go there.
My experience of the war and the huge number of casualties caused by mines, many of them children, led me to start Sandy Gore's Afghanistan Appeal. Since 1986, we've provided artificial limbs and appliances to more than 20,000 patients and physiotherapy for about 50,000. With much work still to be done, more than 20 years after my first visit to Afghanistan, I retraced my original journey. But this time it was on behalf of my appeal on a sponsored walk up the Panjshir Valley to raise money for the charity.
One of the committee members came up with the idea to do a fundraising walk, and we thought, what a unique place to do it in, and we were sure there would be lots of kind of robust people who wouldn't mind walking and camping up the Panjshir Valley. So we took a sponsored walk last September of 24 walkers, and the idea was that they should see some of the work being done in 2 of the clinics in Kabul and then spend 10 days doing this 100-mile hike up the Panjshir Valley.
I hadn't intended to go back, but I found the invitation quite irresistible. First of all, the Panjshir Valley is staggeringly beautiful. It runs from 7,000 feet up, locked high in the Hindu Kush Mountains. So it was very tempting to go back. And secondly, the actual charity itself, which is for providing prostheses for mainly children and often women who had stepped on mines in the course of their work and blown their feet off. It's a wonderful cause. And on one occasion I was ahead of the walk, came into a village, and there was a wire bridge, and there was a young man making his way across like an acrobat, hand over hand, and as I approached, he dropped to the ground and came limping towards us.
A young man came up and with great pride showed that he in fact had a below-knee prosthesis provided by Sandy Gall.
A little knot of villagers appeared around us and immediately invited us to tea, and as Sandy came along, a little cry went up of Sandy Gall, Sandy Gall. I can tell you that gave me a lump in the throat.
It was amazing for people to see patients being treated, the sort of children with problems and disabled, and just people they met in the Panjshir, and just what people's lives are like.
The service that SGA provides is really essential because, very sadly, the government health service in Afghanistan were largely destroyed. Many of the doctors left. In fact, when I first went to Jalalabad, there was no orthopedic surgeon at all, and the general surgeons were having to cope with the orthopedic problems. Basically, the SGA in the northeast of Afghanistan provides a major service, not just for artificial limbs, but also for splints, and for, of course, the physiotherapy, which is essential to teach people how to use these devices.
America's strategy is to unite the patchwork of squabbling warlords under President Karzai and to give him the means and the money to do the job which history has shown cannot be done by outsiders.
You've got to make the Afghans do it themselves, because everybody who's tried in the past to interfere with them or change their course has failed. The one thing that unites them is the presence of a foreigner, and there's got to be a way of dealing with Afghanistan without exciting that terrific natural xenophobia.
The most important lesson from the Afghan history can be, come there as friends, not conquerors. People can trust you if they think you have good intentions.
And I mean, I think that lesson was proved in the 19th century with the British, in the 20th century with the Russians, and is now being proved in the 21st century with the Americans.
It's important to know one's history and to understand the history. Britain has a long history. Afghanistan has a much longer and more convoluted and intricate history.
Afghanistan doesn't need statements. Afghanistan needs soldiers, money, and real determination to make it stable.
It is a message that Afghans have tried to impress on the West many times, perhaps none more tellingly than the assassinated Mujahideen leader Ahmad Shah Massoud over 20 years ago.
The responsibility for this will lie on the shoulders of the present leaders of the West. Today they have the power, but they are idly sitting by and watching what the Russians are doing in Afghanistan. They content themselves with words, but they've done nothing so far. The responsibility for what happens in the future rests with them, and one day they will have to answer to their own people.
Will President Karzai succeed despite the fanatical opposition of a resurgent Taliban supported by Al-Qaeda and fundamentalist groups in Pakistan? For the past 2,000 years, Afghans have suffered wars and devastation. The past 20 years have been especially grim, but there have also been periods of great cultural renaissance. Today, I believe, Afghans face the possibility of a real revival. History proves that that may be possible again.